So, Dr. Ornish, very nice to meet you digitally. Hi. And thank you very much for your kindness and your time to do this interview. I know you did a lot of effort to try to change things in your agenda so you could meet us in person at the conference next week, but it wasn't possible, and I really hope we can manage to get you there at the next conference in 2 years. But for today, we'll do it in this way.
Well, I would love to. I love being in the Netherlands, and particularly in Amsterdam, one of my favorite places in the world, so I would welcome that opportunity.
Oh, that's great. So, just to give you some background, people who are listening, about 400 people, most of them are in healthcare, either mental health care or in hospitals, and some of them are in research or as managers in the care, or either students or families, patients, so it's quite a wide audience. And the theme of the conference is healthcare in crisis. We feel our healthcare in Holland is a little bit in crisis. And we chosen a sign out of the Chinese alphabet, which is made out of 2 signs. One of them is danger and the other one is opportunity. And we thought that your work might give us some opportunity instead of danger for our healthcare system.
Well, I think that's a great idea because, as you know, change is hard, whether it's changing lifestyle, whether it's changing behavior, whether it's changing the way we view the world, our mental health. But if you're in enough pain, then the idea of change becomes more appealing. It's kind of like people go, wow, that's going to be hard to do, but boy, I'm hurting so badly, I'm willing to try pretty much anything. And then when they make these changes, the pain goes away, particularly when they change their lifestyle, their chest pain goes away, their angina improves, their joints improve, but also the deeper pain, the depression scores are cut in half in just a few months, in some ways working better than antidepressants like SSRIs. They often look back on the pain as a blessing in disguise, saying things like, having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me. And somebody might say, what, are you crazy? And they say, no, that's what it took to get my attention to begin making these changes that have transformed my life into such a degree that I might not have done otherwise. That in that sense, it was really a blessing. I mean, in fact, that's how I got interested in doing this work in my own life when I was 19 and became profoundly and suicidally depressed. That was my doorway. But unfortunately, as doctors and health professionals, we're not often trained to view pain as a doorway or as an opportunity, but rather as something to be killed or numbed or bypassed, literally or figuratively, as quickly as possible. And so I really appreciate the chance to be here today to share our experience of how people can use suffering as a doorway for transforming their lives for the better, the crisis as an opportunity.
Thank you. So, major disease as a blessing instead of a curse. And I'm sure the audience would be interested to hear a little bit more what you just said about your own experience when you were 19 and you were having this depression, and how did you get out of it yourself, and how did it inform your life and your science afterwards?
Well, it's a blessing, but I would never go up to somebody who's suffering and say, hey, what a great blessing you're having. A proper response would be a nice Hawaiian punch or something. But for me, it certainly was, having survived it. I mean, I came about as close to committing suicide as a person can do without actually doing it. I was 19 years old. I was a freshman in college at a small university in Texas called Rice University, which I didn't know at the time, but wasn't in their course catalog, but it had the highest suicide rate of any school per capita in the U.S. And I soon learned why. I wanted to be a doctor, so I was taking pre-medical classes, and one of the classes that you have to take in the United States is organic chemistry. And my organic chemistry professor at the time, I was convinced had fled Nazi Germany and come to Texas rather than Argentina to be my professor. And he said on the first day of class, I am going to weed you out. This is a weed out course. And look to the left and look to the right, and one of you won't be here at the end of the semester. Now, this was a school where half the student body either graduated first or second in their high school classes, and everybody was used to making, straight A's. So they put everybody under a bell curve, and so now, a third of the class was making C's and D's and F's. And so I began to worry that I wouldn't do well, and the more I began to worry, the harder it became to study, and the harder it became to study, the more I began to worry. It became a vicious cycle. And so I got to a point where I literally couldn't sleep for a week straight, and that kind of sleep deprivation itself will make you a little crazy, as you know. It's when they torture prisoners, they don't let them sleep for a week straight. And I remember sitting in chemistry class and saying, you know what? why don't I just kill myself? And then I'll be done with all this pain. Then I won't have to worry. You know, it's like, why did I think of that before? It's like, because I'm stupid. And the combination, I really felt like I was a fraud, that I had somehow managed to fool the admissions committee that I was smart, but now that I was in a school with a bunch of really smart people, it was just a matter of time before they figured out what a mistake they'd made in letting me in. And in addition to the feeling like I was a fraud and stupid, I had a bona fide spiritual vision, which is that nothing can bring lasting happiness. And I knew at a very deep level that even if I got all the things that, you know, our culture tells us will bring happiness, you know, if I got rich and famous and married a beautiful woman and, you know, all those kinds of things, then I'd be happy. I knew that wasn't the case. And so the combination of feeling like I was never going to amount to anything because I was stupid, and even if I did, it wouldn't matter anyway, it was profoundly depressing. So that's when I decided I was just going to do myself in. And I was all set to do that. I was going to get drunk and run my car into the side of a bridge, and then people would just think I got drunk and they wouldn't know the real reason. But then I got so run down from being up for a week straight that I got a really bad case of infectious mononucleosis, where I didn't even have the strength to get out of bed. And by then my parents got wind that all was not well with their son. They came and saw what a wreck I was. And I went home to Dallas, and my plan was to recuperate and get strong enough to kill myself, as crazy as that sounds. So meanwhile, my older sister, this was back in 1971, 72, had been kind of a child of the 60s, and she got involved with yoga and began studying with an ecumenical spiritual teacher named Swami Satchidananda. And it really turned her life around. So my parents decided to have a cocktail party for the Swami when he came to Dallas. This was, again, in 1971, 72, which was a pretty weird, even today in Dallas, that would be weird, but
yes,
it's especially
also in
weird.
Holland.
So he came into our living room and he gave a little lecture. And you know, there's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and that was certainly true for me. So he walks in our front door wearing these orange saffron robes, long gray beard, typical archetypal Swami. And he started by saying, "Nothing can bring you lasting happiness," which I'd already figured out, but I was ready to do myself in, and he was glowing, you know, and joyful. And I thought, what am I missing here? So he went on to say what probably sounds like a New Age cliche, but it really turned my life around, which is that nothing can bring you lasting happiness, but we have that already. And that the goal of all spiritual practices, whatever, once you get past all of the rituals and things that people fight and kill each other over, is that the basis of all spiritual practices is that they quiet down our mind and body enough to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being. One that didn't come because we got something we thought was going to make us happy, but rather that's our natural state, is to be peaceful and happy. And in one of perhaps the great ironies of life, we end up running after all these things thinking that they're going to make us happy. If only I could get more money, more power, more beauty, more accomplishment, whatever that blank happens to be, if only I could get more blank, then I'd be happy, then I wouldn't feel so alone, then people would love me and respect me, and then everything would be great. And so what I learned is that, you know, in the process of running after all these things, we disturb our own inner sense of peace and joy and well-being that we could have if we just stopped doing that. And the Swami liked to make puns. He said later in life, somebody said, "What are you, a Hindu?" He'd say, "No, I'm an undu," you know. And so all these techniques, whether it's healthy eating, meditation, yoga, love and support, really help us to simply stop disturbing what's already there. Now that may sound like semantics, but it's really everything. Because if you think that you have to get your health and your peace and your joy and your well-being from outside you, then everybody who has something that you think you need has power over you, has control over you. And if you don't get it, then you're not going to be happy. And so the stakes go up and the stresses go up, because it's not just winning or losing or getting something, it's being a winner or a loser. And people think winners are loved and you feel good, and losers are lonely and isolated and depressed. And so the stakes go up, the stresses go up, and then we over time, those chronic stresses can cause us to both engage in behaviors that are more likely to make us healthy. People are much more likely to smoke and overeat and drink too much and work too hard and abuse substances when they're depressed. I've had patients say things to me like, "I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes and they're always there for me and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me?" Or food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or alcohol or other drugs numb the pain, or those kinds of things.
Hearing you speak like this, it really resonates what you're saying, but I almost feel like I've suddenly the whole scenery changed, and I'm in a new age workshop weekend. No, I'm joking. But so I would almost forget that you're a professor of medicine, a medical doctor, and you have been doing research that really put things upside down in the medical world. In the 90s, you showed that heart disease can be reversed by changing diet and doing exercise and yoga. And that was something nobody would even believe at that time. And still, I think some people have difficulty believing it, even though you have been doing follow-up studies and have proved it again and again, not only with heart disease, also with prostate cancer. And later you showed in other journals like PNAS and JAMA and Lancet Oncology, Urology, all big medical journals, you showed that these effects are real and they can be measured and they have a huge impact on our lives in case of finance, health, etc. So can you explain how should we put this together? You are like, one time you're speaking about spirituality and about Swami and about these things, and at the same time you're doing strong medical research in the most prestigious journals. So you're both?
They are both, actually. We're using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove the power of these very simple, low-tech, low-cost, and often ancient interventions. And my work is really about to address the underlying cause. You know, sometimes when I lecture, I'll show a cartoon of doctors busily mopping up the floor around a sink that's overflowing, but nobody's turning off the faucet. And the faucet is, to a large degree, the lifestyle choices that we make each day. What we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and how much love and support we get. You know, eat well, stress less, move more, love more. Now, that may sound kind of new age, that may sound kind of touchy-feely. I used to get very defensive when people would say things like what you just said and say, oh, no, look at the hard science, and here's our changes in quantitative coronary arteriography and radionuclide ventriculography and cardiac positron emission tomography and blah, blah, blah. And then one day I said, you know what? This is touchy-feely. That's what makes it work. We are touchy-feely creatures. We're creatures of community. That's how we've survived as a species all these years. I wrote a book back in 1998 called Love and Survival that reviewed what were then hundreds and now thousands of studies showing that people who are lonely and depressed and isolated are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely than those who have a sense of love and connection and community. In part, as I mentioned earlier, because you're more likely to abuse yourself, smoke, overeat, drink too much, work too hard, and so on, but also through mechanisms that we don't fully understand. And to me, part of the value of science is to raise awareness, because to me, awareness is always the first step in healing. And if we're really talking about addressing the underlying causes, it's not enough to give people information. I mean, if information were enough, nobody would smoke. It's not like you tell a patient, oh, I want you to quit smoking. Did you know it's bad for you? They go, I didn't know that. I'll quit today. It's like everybody knows it. It's on every package of cigarettes. So you have to say, why do people smoke? And why do they overeat and drink too much and work too hard and abuse themselves? And that's where you inevitably get into the psychosocial, the emotional, and even the spiritual dimensions of health and illness. And by the way, and when we work at that level, then we find that people are much more likely to make and maintain lifestyle choices that are life-enhancing than that are self-destructive. And what we've been able to document in the most esoteric ways, we're about to publish a study on angiogenesis, for example. As you mentioned, we've shown changes in telomeres and gene expression. We can actually, your body has this amazing ability in most cases to begin healing itself if you simply stop doing what's causing the problem, which to a large degree are these lifestyle choices that we make each day.
Yes. So you just mentioned how difficult it can be for people to change their lifestyle, even though we all know it's important for us not to smoke and to exercise and healthy eating. And in the literature there have been so many debates on which factors are important to make these lasting behavioral changes. For instance, to make it people make small steps and having good experiences and making registration of their behavior. So in your experience from the last years, which factors would you say are most influential, most important to bring lasting changes?
Well, it's a really important question because everything I was trained to do turned out to be wrong. I was trained in medical school to try to scare people into change. I mean, the whole concept of even risk factor reduction and prevention, and in many ways, is fear-based. Put that cigarette down, you're going to get lung cancer, or put that cheeseburger down, you're going to get a heart attack, or whatever. And what I've learned I've been doing this now for almost 40 years. I'm 96, I look pretty good, don't you think? But is that Fear is not a sustainable motivator in anything, whether it's in heart disease, whether it's in politics, whether it's in global warming. It's part of the reason why, when Al Gore did An Inconvenient Truth, everybody's, trying to drive smaller cars and putting in fluorescent light bulbs. And that lasted, a little while, then people stopped thinking about it because fear is not a sustainable motivator. We all know we're going to die. The mortality rate is still 100%, it's one per person, but it's not something most people think about all the time. And so efforts to try to motivate people to change their behavior, or even to take their medications based on fear, are not sustainable. I mean, for someone, let's say, who's had a heart attack, they'll do pretty much anything their doctor tells them for like 6 weeks. And then they go back to their old behaviors. And the doctors that I work with say, come on, I can't even get my patients to eat less red meat. You're going to have them be vegetarian and meditate and exercise and do yoga and love more. How in the world can people do that? I mean, the studies were showing actually that most people are not even taking their statin drugs like Lipitor. The idea is that taking a pill is easy, everybody will do it. Changing lifestyle, that's way too hard. People can't do that. But the pharma company's own data show that 2/3 of the people who are prescribed statin drugs like Lipitor and Zocor and Mevacor and Pravachol and so on aren't taking them just 6 months to a year after they're prescribed, even if someone else is paying for them and even if they don't have side effects. You might say, well, why aren't they if they're beneficial, particularly for people with heart disease? And the reason is they're fear-based. I mean, if you really kind of cut to the chase, it's like, take this pill, this Lipitor, for example. It's not going to make you feel better. Hopefully it won't make you feel worse to prevent something really awful like a heart attack or stroke from happening maybe years down the road that you don't want to think about, so people stop taking it. But on the other hand, when people make lifestyle choices, we're getting 85 to 90% adherence to a very intensive reversing heart disease program in all the almost 60 sites now that we've trained with thousands and thousands of patients. Whereas it's much harder to do that than to take a pill. So how can that be? Well, the reason is that the pill doesn't make you feel better, but the lifestyle choices do. And because these underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, most people find that they feel so much better so quickly when they make these changes, to the degree they make them, that it reframes the reason for making these changes from fear of dying, which is not sustainable, to joy of living, which is. Their chest pain goes away. They think more clearly. Their blood flow to the brain improves. The latest studies are showing that you can actually grow so many new brain neurons through a process called neuroplasticity or neurogenesis in just 2 or 3 months, that your brain can get measurably bigger, particularly the parts of your brain you want to get bigger, like the hippocampus that controls memory, which often people start to forget where they put their keys and so on, or what was that person's name as they get older. You can regenerate a lot of that. Those are really the key things that make lifestyle choices sustainable.
Great. So instead of putting them into fear, seducing them into good experiences.
That's right. Because pleasure is sustainable and fear is not.
Yeah. Okay. So I noticed a lot of studies you've been doing on the heart, on the prostate, on gene expression, telomeres. I also saw 2 studies where you involved also mental health, depressive symptoms in patients with high risk of cardiac problems. Could you elaborate a little bit on your experiences with patients with psychiatric problems and how they could benefit from lifestyle changes?
Well, I think depression is the real epidemic, certainly in the US, and I imagine in the Netherlands as well. I mean, the number one category of prescription drugs the last 20 years is not even statin drugs, it's antidepressants. And yet we found that depression scores were cut almost in half in the patients that went through our program. But we're not focusing on depression, we're not focusing on any one thing, we're focusing on health. And so when people eat better, when they exercise, when they meditate and do yoga, and when they have love and support, everything seems to get better. It's not like we had one lifestyle program for reversing heart disease, a different one for depression, a different one for reversing prostate cancer or diabetes or gene expression or telomere length. It was the same program for all of these things. And in every case we found the more you change, the more you improve at any age, which is a very empowering message to give people. But our support groups are not just the usual kind of support groups. In the very first study I did back in 1977, 38 years ago, I thought the support group was going to help people stay on the diet or exchange recipes and types of running shoes and those kinds of things. And what I kind of unwittingly did was to create a safe environment for people to let down their emotional defenses and talk openly and authentically about what's really going on in their lives without fear that someone's going to judge them or criticize them or give them glib advice. So that sense of a safe environment is what people are really hungry for. There's been a radical shift in our culture in the Western world in the last 50 years with the breakdown of the social networks that used to give people a sense of connection and community. 50 years ago, people had an extended family that they saw regularly. They'd have a neighborhood with 2 or 3 generations of people that lived together. They'd have a church or synagogue they went to regularly. They'd have a job that was secure that they'd been at for decades. And most people don't have any of those things anymore. And what we've learned, as I mentioned earlier, is that when people feel lonely and depressed and isolated, they're many times more likely to get sick and die prematurely. So our support groups are a way of trying to recreate what we've lost by creating a safe environment where somebody can just be authentic. And they can say something like, I don't know, like, oh, I might look like the perfect dad, but my kid's on drugs. Or I might look like I'm really successful, but I'm really not. And then someone else can focus on what they're feeling and express it as a feeling, because it's our feelings that connect us. And instead of saying, oh, well, why don't you send your kid to a drug rehab program, like they hadn't thought of that, to say, wow, that must feel really awful, or gosh, I'm really so sorry to hear that, or my kid has this problem, or I used to have a drug problem, whatever it happens to be, and suddenly you don't feel so alone and isolated anymore. And that sense of connection and community is a primal human need that so often goes unfulfilled, that when you can meet that need, when people feel that sense of love and support, they're much more likely to change their lifestyle, to quit smoking, to do all these other things, because you're getting much closer to the root of why people make lifestyle choices that may not necessarily be in their best interest.
Right, so these are also societal issues, and there it's almost like medicine is meeting the society, where things like you just mentioned, social bonding, but also advertisements and the way we teach people, young children in school, what we do and do not teach them. So would you say that we need changes not only in medicine, but also on a societal level to be able to do these things we want to do?
Absolutely. And yet, to me, part of the value of research is that it can raise awareness. And awareness is always the first step in healing and is always the first step in action. What Al Gore is doing with global warming is raising awareness. People can take different actions. They can drive smaller cars, or I have an electric car, for example. I have a Tesla, whatever it happens to be. The same is true with our culture. People are making different choices. McDonald's, I consulted with McDonald's CEO back in 2000 to get them to try to make healthier food, to put salads on the menu, to take the trans fats out of their French fries. I figure even incremental change on that scale may be worth doing. And they did it, but they didn't really do it. And now their sales have been going down substantially. People aren't buying the hamburgers at the same rate they were. I chaired PepsiCo's health advisory board for the same reason. Soft drink sales are going down, but their CEO realizes that the trend is more towards health and choices that give people a sense of purpose and meaning. And so they're beginning to reformulate what they're selling people. And then they can start using all their advertising and so on to influence people to make healthier choices rather than to buy junk food. So I'm always trying to find, I chaired Google's health advisory board. I'm always trying to find levers and platforms that I can use to help educate people, so to empower them with information that can transform their lives for the better. Not to blame, but to empower.
Right, right. An important part of your program involves diet. And I noticed that you put a lot of emphasis on low fats in your diet. Then I've seen a lot of debate going on between your diet and Atkins and other ones. And I also noticed that some people criticize you for that, others are supportive. So would you elaborate a little bit on the differences and similarities of the two diets and maybe other diets as well?
Sure. Well, I debated Dr. Atkins more times than I can count before he died, and probably from heart disease, according to his medical records that were released. And so, unfortunately, he got pegged as the low-carb guy, and I got pegged as the low-fat guy. But my diet has never been a low-fat diet per se. It's a whole foods diet. It's fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, soy products. It's basically a whole foods plant-based diet with foods as close as possible in their natural forms. That's also low in refined carbohydrates like sugar. And so Dr. Atkins was right to the extent that he said sugar is not good for you, but we've been saying that for a long time. But he would then say, well, don't eat sugar, eat pork rinds and bacon and sausage and meat, and those are not health foods. I'd like to be able to tell you that they are, but they're not. An optimal diet is low in animal protein and high in plant-based protein. It's naturally low in fat. But it has enough of the good fats, things like the omega-3 fatty acids that you find in fish oil or flaxseed oil or in the plankton-based omega-3 fatty acids. And so it's not this versus that. It's like an optimal diet is a whole foods, plant-based diet. There's increasing evidence coming out that animal protein itself, it's not just fat versus carbs, it's the animal protein itself may be toxic. And there's a study that came out in Cell Metabolism in March by Levine and others showing that people who eat a lot of animal protein have a 75% higher risk of premature death from all causes, a 400% increased risk from cancers, and a 500% increased risk from type 2 diabetes. Again, these are big differences. Now, part of the confusion has come when people like Atkins and then his later followers like Gary Taubes and others who say Americans, and I guess it's probably true in the Netherlands, but I can speak for sure in the US, Americans have been told to eat less fat. They're fatter than ever, and so fat is passé. That's not the issue. And this has been repeated so many times it's almost become a meme, in the echo chamber of what passes as modern media these days. So I went back to the U.S. Department of Agriculture database and said, okay, I know Americans have been told to eat less fat, but what have they actually been eating? And I just want to look to my notes here so I can give you the actual numbers, because it turns out that in every decade since 1950, Americans have been eating more fat, 67% more fat, 39% more sugar and sweeteners, 800 more calories, 57 pounds more meat. So we may have been told to eat less fat, but we're actually eating more fat, more sugar, more meat, and more calories than ever. So it's not surprising that people are fatter. But again, these are all theoretical considerations. The real bottom line is cholesterol. I mean, there was a report that came out from the U.S. Dietary guidelines earlier last week now, saying that people can eat as much dietary cholesterol as they want. That cholesterol, eat all the eggs you want. Eggs really don't matter. Red meat doesn't really matter. Well, it turns out that it does matter. And in part, first of all, we found a 40% reduction in LDL cholesterol in people who went through our studies without drugs because we asked people to make bigger changes. Even the Mediterranean diet, people say, oh, that's the best diet. That prevents heart disease. There was an article that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine called the PREDIMED study last year saying that the Mediterranean diet reduced the risk of heart attacks. But if you actually look at the data carefully, what they found is it reduced the risk of stroke, but it actually didn't reduce the risk of heart attacks, because it was only when they pooled the cardiovascular data and the stroke data that the stroke data was such a big reduction, it pulled down the heart data. But if you look at the heart attack data in isolation, there was no reduction. And what they're comparing, what they call a low-fat diet, is generally not very low in fat, and it's generally high in sugar. So that's not a good trade-off either. But the bottom line is really not cholesterol, but heart disease. Cholesterol is not a disease. It's only important to the degree that it affects your arteries. And what we found in our studies, as you alluded to, is that through every measure, whether it was in the first studies, whether it was blood flow to the heart, or the ability of the heart to pump blood, or the amount of blockages in the arteries, or the amount of cardiac events, we found that we could actually reverse that. That when people make these kinds of changes that I'm recommending, they get better to the degree they make them. And the longer they stay on them, the more improvement we measure. And like you said, we also found that these same lifestyle choices that can reverse heart disease can slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of men with early stage prostate cancer, can reverse type 2 diabetes better than drugs can change gene expression in over 500 genes in just 3 months. That's how dynamic these mechanisms are, turning on the good genes that protect us, downregulating or turning off, particularly what are called the RAS oncogenes that promote prostate, breast, and colon cancer, are turned off. It's amazing how dynamic. And most recently, as you alluded to, we found that we can increase telomerase and actually lengthen telomeres in a study we published in the Lancet Oncology to the degree that people are making these changes. It's the only intervention in a controlled study that can actually lengthen telomeres. And as you know, telomeres are the ends of our chromosomes that control how long we live. And as our telomeres get shorter, our lives get shorter. We found we could actually make them longer, in a sense, beginning to reverse aging at a cellular level. So it saddens me that there's so much confusion. People say, oh, these damn doctors, they can't make up their minds. To hell with them, just bring out the bacon and eggs and don't worry about it, because they're always, first they say this and then they say that. But if you actually look at the literature in depth as I have, it's very clear that a whole foods plant-based diet in combination with walking a half an hour a day, doing some simple yoga and meditation, and having more love and support in your life can not only help prevent but even reverse the most common illnesses through mechanisms that we're getting increasingly that are increasingly well defined.
So if people themselves can even cure from changing their lifestyle, if lifestyle is so important in getting the disease, could we say that people, it's their own fault that they become sick? And should we even take it further and say people who have a bad lifestyle should be punished and pay more for their insurance or more taxes, and people who have a healthy lifestyle should be
I think we should
rewarded?
just shoot them all, and then we won't have to pay for anything. No. Of course not. To be responsible, to say that our lifestyle choices affect our health, to blame is not to empower is not to blame. These are, if we're just a victim of bad genes or bad fate or bad karma or bad whatever, then what can you do? I've been working with President Clinton on his diet since 1993 when he became president. And Hillary Clinton asked me to work with the chefs that cook for them, initially in the White House and then with Camp David and at the Air Force One and the Navy Mess and so on. And then I became one of his consulting physicians and would work with him and come in for his annual physicals at the Bethesda Naval Hospital every year and so on. And we became friends. In fact, I just had dinner with him again last week. And 5 years ago, when his bypasses clogged up, he was told, oh, it's all in your genes, there's nothing you can do about it. And I sent him an email, and then we later met, and I said, it's not all in your genes. And I say that not to blame you, but to empower you. Because if it's all in your genes, then you're just a victim, and you're like one of the most powerful guys on the planet. You're hardly a victim. And so he began to make these changes. His heart disease is reversing. He's lost 25 pounds. He looks great. And I think it sets a great example for everyone. So to blame, to empower people with things is not to blame them. And I'm a much more believer in the carrot than in the stick. And if we can make it easier for people to make healthier choices and to reward them for doing so, and they can feel the reward in their own lives. You know, they look better, they feel better, they have better sex, they don't need as much sleep, they lose weight, you know, they look younger. You know, all these things really become their own reward. I don't think you need to punish people. I think you need to incentivize them and empower them.
Right, right. So I get this idea, looking from your work and from your books and your journals, papers, that you've been shifting a little bit from more the mechanical side of changing heart disease to your later work where you seem to be more open of the spiritual side?
No, that's not true. No, it's always been part of my work. Unfortunately, people tend to focus on the diet. And to me, the diet's important, but it's always been the least interesting part. It's kind of a conspiracy of love, if you might call it that. My wife, Ann, calls it a Trojan horse. You know, it becomes the doorway for many people to get interested. But as I learned when I was in college, if you told me when I was 19 years old and about to kill myself that I was going to live longer if I just exercised more or changed my diet, I'd say, you don't get it. I'm just trying to, I don't know if I want to live longer. I'm just trying to get through the day. And so if we don't address these issues of meaning and these deeper issues, it's very hard to get people to make sustainable changes. You know, 50 years ago, there was a wonderful book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And he looked at people who survived concentration camps in World War II. Kind of the most extreme version of a stressful environment. And he found that it wasn't always the medically healthiest people that survived. It was the people who had a sense of meaning. Like, I've got to get out of here so I can get reunited with my loved ones, so I can, you know, write a book about this, whatever, to bear witness, whatever it happens to be. I mean, even when I was talking with President Clinton, I asked him what I always ask my patients. I said, why do you want to live longer? You know, there's an implicit assumption that people want to live longer, but many people aren't so sure. They're depressed, and telling somebody who's lonely and depressed that they're going to live longer if they just eat healthier or change their behavior, it doesn't really resonate with them. So he said, well, I want to live long enough to walk my daughter down the aisle and to and see my first grandchild. And then when I had dinner with him last week, he said, well, I've done that. I said, so now what's giving you meaning? As if it's meaningful, then it's sustainable. And he said, well, he thought about it. He said, well, now I've got to make enough money to put them through college, you know. So the point is that we need to work at a deeper level and not just focus on the behaviors and not just give people information. Again, if information were enough, nobody would smoke. We need to work at a deeper level. And when we do, then we find that people are much more likely to make sustainable changes that are good for them.
Would you say that when you were 19 and you suffered from this depression, then you mentioned there was a change in your life, right? And now you have been doing for 35, 40 years all of this work on lifestyle changes. could you find somehow like a development in your own personal life and maybe also together with your professional life that went to like a further increase in insights and which is most important?
Well, sure. There's an old saying that you teach what you want to learn, and that's certainly been true for me. And while I began that process at 19, it's still an ongoing process. I'm still a work in progress, as we all are. And I'm still learning every day. And what I'm learning, particularly now, besides the science and exploring new diseases, breast cancer and Alzheimer's and things like that, is how important intimacy is. And this may get us back into the touchy-feely realm, but I think it's the realm that is the most meaningful and the most transformative and ultimately the most powerful in terms of what causes people to get better and to heal. I'm interested, like all cultures and all religions, for example, have dietary guidelines, but they're all different from each other. In one culture you can eat this but not that, but in the other culture you can eat that but not this, or there are certain times of day or certain days of the year or certain days of the week. It's like, what's going on here? Is God confused? And to me it's just the act of choosing not to do something that you otherwise could do imbues it with deep meaning. And then if it's meaningful, as we've been talking about, it's sustainable. And so, if you tell a patient, eat this, don't eat that, do this, don't do that, they immediately want to do the opposite. This goes back to the first dietary intervention, when God said don't eat the apple, and that didn't go so well, and that was God talking, so we're not going to do better than that. So what I've learned is that whether something feels like deprivation or whether it feels meaningful is all the difference in the world in terms of how likely they are to do it and what kind of effect it's going to have on it. So if somebody says, gosh, I can't eat meat and I can't eat this and I can't do that, then you feel deprived. And if you feel deprived, then sooner or later you're going to get off it. And the whole language of behavioral change has this judgmental, moralistic quality to it anyway. I cheated on my diet. I can't go out to dinner. Anybody who's watching this who's a health professional probably can't go out to dinner without someone either apologizing for what they're eating or commenting on what you're eating, whatever. And I say, I'm not the food police, eat whatever you want. But we have all this judgment. Once you call foods good or bad, it's a small step to saying I'm a bad person because I eat bad food. And then you have all those toxic emotions of guilt and shame and anger and humiliation, which really are bad for you. So to me, I wrote a book called The Spectrum, which says, look, food is just food, but some foods are healthier. So I simply categorize them from the most healthy group 1 to the least healthy group 5. And so what matters most is your overall way of eating and living. So if you indulge yourself one day, it doesn't mean you cheated or you're bad or you failed. Just eat healthier the next. You don't have time to exercise one day, do a little more the next. You don't have time to meditate for an hour, do it for a minute. Whatever you have, there's a corresponding benefit. It's not all or nothing. And then it's also a much more compassionate approach because you can't fail. There's no diet to get on, so there's no diet to get off. It's just a general guideline. To the degree you move in this direction, there's a corresponding benefit. And so if I feel like, gosh, I can't have any of these things, and that sense of deprivation, that's not sustainable. If I can reframe that and saying, I'm choosing not to eat certain foods, for example, because I can dance at my daughter's wedding, or I can, see my first grandchild, the ways we were talking about earlier, that puts a very different context on it. The same is true for sex. In the 60s when I was growing up, people, it was like the more sex, the better. The more people you have sex with, the more fun it is. And, a lot of people said that it was kind of fun, but ultimately it was like sort of fun, but not nearly as fun as people thought. And then later, there's a spiritual teacher named Ramakrishna who lived 100 years ago in South India. And he said, you can dig a lot of shallow wells and never reach water, or you can dig a deep one and reach the wellspring. And so people began to realize, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a better way. So if you're in a committed monogamous relationship with someone, on the one hand, that can feel like the ball and chain, like, oh my God, I can't have sex with anyone, this is one person, how boring. Or it can be, I'm creating this sacred life, sacred not in the sense of boring, but the most special, the most erotic, the most pleasurable, the most fun, the most wonderful, because that sense of commitment allows both people to feel a sense of safety. And you can only be intimate with someone to the degree you can make yourself emotionally vulnerable to them. You can open your heart to them, if you will. And you can only do that to the degree you feel safe, because otherwise you can get hurt. And everyone's had that experience, and the heart goes, yeah, I'm not going to do that again, I'm going to close up. But then if you close yourself off, then those same barriers that protect us from pain also isolate us. And to the degree that we're always isolated, if they're always up, if you have nowhere that feels safe enough to let them down and no one that you trust enough to open up to, then if you're always isolated, the studies show that you're much more likely to get sick and die prematurely. The very things that we think that are protecting us are actually killing us. And so when people can be in a committed monogamous relationship, like my wife Ann and I are, then we find that it's much more erotic and playful and intimate and sexual and all the wonderful things than either one of us ever imagined. Most of the time when we have a date together, it's like the most amazing experience that any of us have ever experienced. I mean, you can't even imagine those things, because even to imagine something is to limit by preconceptions. And to the degree that you feel that sense of safety from that commitment, then you're open to all degrees of freedom, all possibilities, all expressions of love, without those kinds of limitations that become self-fulfilling. And so rather than the ball of chain, it becomes the most transformative and pleasurable. And if it's pleasurable and meaningful, then it's sustainable, whether it's diet or whether it's any aspect of life. So that's my growing edge right now.
Wow, and I'm sure many people will be very curious hearing you speak about so many lifestyle factors to hear a little bit more about your own lifestyle at the moment. Would you share something with us?
Well, I just did.
You must be very busy, no? And how do you deal with stress management or going by planes and different time zones? And are you a yogi all the time, or how do you do?
Well, as I mentioned, my teacher was telling me meditation isn't just something you do with your eyes closed repeating a sound. Your whole life becomes a meditation if you can bring that awareness to it, that sense of mindfulness to it, that sense of everything you do, you're doing with awareness. And for me, it's with a sense of meaning and joy. I mean, I just flew my 3 millionth mile on United Airlines, and I've got 2 million miles on American. I travel way too much, but I'm generally gone for just a day or so at a time because I don't want to be away from my family. So I'll take a lot of very short trips so I can be home. Because for me, being with my wife and kids is heaven. And so I do a lot, but because I have a profound sense that what I'm doing is meaningful. It's meaningful in terms of my own personal growth, and I'd like to think that it's meaningful in terms of helping other people, especially now that Medicare is covering my program. It took us 16 years. I used to think if we just did good science, that would change medical practice, and to some degree it did, but not nearly as much as I hoped. What I learned is that if it's not reimbursable, it's not sustainable. It has to be meaningful and reimbursable. And now that Medicare is covering my program as a Dr. Dean Ornish program, which surprised me after 16 years of review with bipartisan support from the White House, from the Senate, from the House of Representatives, from leading medical experts, it tells 16 years, but they're now doing that. That's a real paradigm shift. And now that Medicare is paying for it, most of the other insurance companies are doing so as well. I've met several times with Prince Charles in the UK about doing something similar with the National Health Service. They're scheduled to go bankrupt in a few years if they just keep doing the same things. But if we can address the more fundamental causes of why people get sick, as we've been talking about, which to a large degree are these lifestyle choices, then we can make better care available to more people at much lower costs. We did a study with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Pennsylvania called Highmark, and they found they cut their overall healthcare costs by 50% in the first year. So we can make better care available. And what's good for you is good for the planet. It turns out that more global warming is caused by eating meat and livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. And when you eat higher in the food chain, it takes 10 times more energy, more resources than if you're eating a whole foods plant-based diet. We have enough food now to feed the entire planet if everyone were moving in a plant-based direction. So unfortunately, what's happening is that other countries are starting to eat like we are in the U.S., to live like we are, and unfortunately to die like we are. And more people are dying today from heart disease and type 2 diabetes throughout the world than from AIDS, TB, and malaria combined. And it's diverting a lot of precious resources away from things that really do require drugs, like AIDS, TB, and malaria, to things that can be largely prevented or reversed by changing lifestyle. So all these things are really creating a real strong sense of meaning and purpose in my life, which enables me to work at a high level without getting sick in the process.
Right. You just mentioned Medicare and the reimbursement of your program. I wrote somewhere in an earlier interview that it was not really, they were not bursting of enthusiasm when you first came to their door. I think they mentioned they mentioned something like healing crystals and pyramids would also be reimbursed. So you have a lot of perseverance to go on for 16 years, and then finally you made it. So maybe you can share something of the success factors, because we have some similar work to do in Holland as well.
Well, it can be discouraging. I'm not sure if I knew at the beginning it was going to take 16 years, I would have done it. But, and that was with the support of Bill Clinton when he was president and Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House, completely different sides of the political spectrum. They all came together around this. It still took 16 years. But I was talking with somebody in the government recently, and I said, it took us 16 years to get Medicare to cover our program, and he kind of raised his eyebrow and he said, only 16 years? Change is hard, whether it's personal change or whether it's institutional change. But if it's meaningful, then you're willing to do what it takes in order to make that happen. At least I am, and I think you are as well. If it were easy, someone else would have already done it. And part of the meaning comes from the fact that it's hard. I was just in the British Virgin Islands with my family on a vacation and learning to kite surf for the first time. And the guy who was teaching me taught Richard Branson how to kite surf. He was a friend of a friend. And this is a guy learning to kite surf in his 60s, kite surfed across the English Channel with Richard Branson. Why would someone in their right mind do that? Because it's hard. Well, the fact that it's hard, and it being in the Guinness Book of World Records, is what makes it fun. It's what makes it meaningful. Now, I will tell you, like any normal person, I get, stressed and frustrated and sometimes want to just say, are you kidding me? Seriously? Do we really have to do all this stuff? At one point in the Medicare process, the head of Medicare at the time, this was, I guess, 15 years ago, said, well, we'll do a demonstration project of your program, but you have to get a letter from the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute or the National Institutes of Health saying that it's safe for older people to walk, meditate, eat vegetables, and quit smoking, as opposed to having their chest cut open. It's at that level. You're going to go, are you serious? And that's what we had to do. But if it's worth it, then it makes it meaningful. And the fact that it's hard in some ways is part of the fun, if I can remember that. Sometimes my work is to be able to remember that in real time and not simply in retrospect.
Right. So I have to be getting to a close here now, and I was just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share with us, advice or whatever for our audience and for people working in Holland now who like who are inspired by your work of making lifestyle medicine working. So what advice do you have for us, or anything else to share?
Well, it's fun doing this work and it's meaningful. And I don't know what the statistics are in Holland, but certainly in the U.S. most doctors wouldn't recommend medicine as a career for their kids. They're burned out. It's not fun. If you have to see a new patient every 10 or 15 minutes, you don't really have time to talk about what really matters. You don't have time about their diet, about their exercise, their family, what's going on at work, what's going on at school, and so on. And so we're trying to create a new paradigm that is much more fun to practice medicine by working as a team of people. It's a doctor, a nurse, a yoga teacher, exercise physiologist, dietitian, psychologists, all working together as a team where the doctor is the quarterback, but a lot of this work can be done by other people. And if your patients know that you really love them and care for them, and they can feel that and you can actually express that to them, as touchy-feely as that may sound, they will become your most loyal patients. They won't sue you. They will be much more likely to take your medications that you prescribe and to change the lifestyle that you're recommending. And it's so much more fun to practice medicine this way. If all we are is a collection of algorithms, we're going to get replaced by an iPhone app before long. So I would just say that this way of practicing medicine is not only good for the patients, it's especially good for those of us who do this work, and I would encourage you to give it a try.
Okay, I'm sure we all do after hearing all of what you said, so thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you in 2 years at our conference.
Thank you so much, a great pleasure.